All right, so when this pops up in a second, it's going to have some vocabulary that we use for people who are English language learners. So there's a few different acronyms that are going to be on the board here. There's ESL, ELL, TESOL or TESOL, and LEP. Does anybody know what any of those stand for? Have you heard about them before? You know, what have you heard, Kevin?
ESL.
What's that?
English as a second language.
Okay, good. Anybody know any of these other ones? ELL, TESOL, LEP? What do you know, Stephanie?
Is ELL English as a learned language?
Close. Not exactly.
English language learner.
English language learner. Good. Anybody know TESOL or LEP? Put them up here. All right, so we have ESL, English as a second language. ELL is English language learner. TESOL is teaching English for speakers of other languages. And then LEP is limited English proficiency. So you might see any of these used in the world of teaching English to non-native speakers. People have strong preferences about some of them. My favorites are these two in the middle, ELL and TESOL. I don't love ESL because it's English as a second language, and for a lot of people, English is not their second language. It might be like their fourth or fifth language. And so that sometimes limits people's mindset of like how broadly this person speaks languages in general. And then LEP, limited English proficiency, that just sounds like a negative thing to me, and it like puts the focus on what they can't do rather than what they can do. So I prefer these two right here, but you might hear any of them out in the world. So we're going to start today by you doing a little bit of brainstorming. Is there anybody here who's never tried to learn another language before? Everyone's tried another language. Okay, great. So I want you to do a little thinking about your own experiences learning a language. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to journal about them. You can write about one or more of these following prompts here. We have, what feelings did you have when you were first learning the language? What did you find easy or difficult about learning the language? What did teachers do that helped you learn or made learning more difficult? What specific exercises or tasks helped you learn the language? Did anything ever turn you off from your journey toward learning the language? And what feelings did you have when you first had to use the language to communicate in a real-world situation? So like a person who didn't speak English but spoke the language you were trying to speak, how did that go? Right. So any of these that you are interested in, we'll write for about 3 minutes. Get your mind rolling. Can I erase what's on the board? Use pictures first. I'm halfway done. right? It looks like most people are wrapping up. So what I'm going to ask you to do is turn to a partner next to you, and I want you to share one thing that you wrote about with your partner. All right? One thing that you wrote about.
When I was married at first, it was like it was just some kind of
Yeah.
Yeah, well, kind of. It was like and we had a
I knew the guitars were there, so we had to actually translate. So they worked out like the creative. It was really just to keep on doing it.
Whoever asked you to wrap up?
It was a lot of practice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So this is just a crash course in teaching English as another language for people. So we're not going to obviously cover everything. I'm also not an expert in the field. I know some about it. I've done it a little bit, but I'm not a huge expert. So what my goals for you are today is I want to get you first in a mindset to be able to think, like, what are the things that I should have in mind if I'm teaching English as a foreign language to somebody? But then the other thing is I want you to come away with some practical tips and skills and activities. So we'll do a little bit of both of those today. So I'm sure that a bunch of you also have expertise that you can bring in just from your experience learning languages. So I want to start quickly with that. So what are some tips based on your experience learning another language, or maybe you've even taught English as another language or taught a different language? What are some tips that you would have for your classmates going into teaching a language to somebody? What worked well for you, didn't work well for you that you would suggest?
Watching videos and listening to music.
Can you say it a little louder?
Watching videos and listening to music that was really close. Like fit into like the conversation and stuff like that.
Great.
Like the pronunciation.
Yeah. Good. And if you're watching videos, you can put the subtitles on. And you can do that in two different ways. You can either put the subtitles on in their native language, or you can put the subtitles on in English, right? And both of those help. Once you're getting better, watching something in English with subtitles in English actually becomes easier than nothing at all. What else? Yeah, Stephanie?
I guess more generally, just be patient with yourself too. I think both of you will be frustrated because clearly, like, you're not doing things maybe as quickly as you want to, but just remind yourself that it's going to take a long time in order to accomplish something like that.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I would actually say that's true for anything that you're teaching with a learning partner, is always be patient, because when you know it, it seems like the other person's probably going to be really slow to pick it up, but it's just natural learning, like it happens slowly.
It just seem like really encouraging and nice. Because sometimes people like feel bad if they can't pronounce something correctly. But like depending on like what their language background is, it can be really hard to pronounce certain sounds in English. So like make sure they don't feel bad about it.
Yeah, definitely supportive. I worked with a Spanish teacher at an old high school, and I really liked his mindset when he said, like, I don't care if they speak Spanish perfectly, I want them to have the confidence to go out and speak to someone who speaks Spanish. If they're traveling, do not be afraid to use it, right? So he felt like if you shut them down all the time and corrected every little thing, that they would be afraid to go and use it after that. What else? Yeah.
My language was learning Italian because I used to live in Italy for a little bit. So when I was there and and people automatically like knew that I was American, they would start to speak to me in English. So for a while I wasn't picking up Italian because people would just speak to me in English. So I had to specifically start asking people to speak to me in Italian, and that's how I picked it up. But I think an important thing of working with our learning partners is if we speak their native language, we have to make sure not to go off on tangents like in Spanish or Chinese or whatever, because then it'll be harder for them to learn.
Yeah, you get less immersion that way, right? The more they hear, the better. So there are times when it would be really helpful, like to get past something to speak their native language, but the more you can keep it in English, the better. All right, I want to give you a sample activity here. When we do this activity, I want you to be thinking about how this activity is good for an English language learner, right? Like how would the way this is structured be good for somebody learning language? We're going to do an abbreviated version, so we're going to do a fast version. What I have up here is answers to questions about me. All right, so all of these are answers to questions about me. What I want you to do is I want you to try to write down the questions that have these answers. So for example, what would the question that has this answer be? Okay, so you would write down, what is your name? Answer, Dave, right? I'm going to give you just 1 minute to do it, which is really, really fast. If this was a class of English language learners, I'd probably give you at least 5 minutes because the processing demands are so much larger for that, right? And there's a lot up here, so probably even more than 5 minutes would be good. For you, just 1 minute to sample. Go ahead and try to write as many questions as you can that have those answers about me. Okay, time's up. I told you to be short. What I want you to do is turn to a partner and I want you to share a couple of the questions you brainstormed. If you have a different question than your partner, like if you thought it was like one question that gets the answer California and your partner thought it was a different one, then discuss why you thought it was the one you did. Okay? So go ahead, turn to a partner and discuss the questions. And we'll just do like 40 seconds this time, really quick. Again, it's going to be very abbreviated.
What's like 36, like how old are you?
Ollie came out of the first one.
Okay, time's up. With your partner. We're going to turn to it in a game for the last part, so we're going to split the room right here between Chung and Stephanie, thank you. And so we're going to do half and half. So what we would do if we were doing this simple activity is I'd have you group a little bit so you can talk to each other, all right? But for this, it's okay. Your team is going to ask one of the questions, all right, and tell me what you think the answer is. I'll write that on the board, right? And if your team is correct, if that's the right question, then your team will get a point. We'll go through a couple of these, all right? So let's start with this team over here. Does someone want to venture a guess at what one of the questions is? You can't do this one, we did that together.
How old are you?
And what do you think the answer is?
36.
That was correct, so you can get a point. All right, this team, want to venture a guess? What is the name of your pet, is what I heard over here. And what's the answer? Sure. phrase the question that way to get that exact answer, because my cat's name is not a cat named Moose. My cat's name is just Moose. So I would probably phrase it a little bit differently. How might we phrase that to get this answer?
Do you have a pet?
Sure, that would work. Do you have a pet? So what I'm modeling there also is I'm gonna work with the answers a little bit to make them like exactly correct. Now, if she had asked, what is name of your pet, and left out the, I would write it exactly as she said, and then as a class we could talk about what was missing there. Okay? All right, let's do one more for each team. What do you think?
What's your favorite food?
What's your favorite food? And what's the answer?
Lasagna.
That is correct. You get a point, and this team over here, one more guess.
Where did you go to college?
Where did you go to college, and what's the answer?
And college.
That is correct. And again, if I saw any mistakes in there, then I would go ahead and correct them after writing it as you said it. This is also a good opportunity for some language learning, right? Like we came up with what's your favorite food, and last time I did this with a class, nobody knew this word, right? Because it's an Italian word, it's not like English phonetics, it's a difficult one. I want to debrief a little bit about the activity. So what do you think about this activity for English language learners? Like, what about it is good for learning a language in the way that we did it? What will be helpful? We can share as a whole class. Yeah.
Well, one thing we discussed earlier is that one problem I sometimes have with language learning is getting stuck on translating things instead of producing like fluid sentences. So this forces you to like formulate your full own responsive sentence.
Sure. Good. And the downside of that is you probably couldn't do it with like very, very early language learners. They might not be at that point. But if you have some people who are starting to get it, then they can formulate little things like this. Yeah. Good. What else? Yeah, Katie?
They get to, so there's like multiple components, like they get to see it, they get to write it, and they also get to speak it.
Yeah, good. So first they're seeing it up here, they're writing it on their paper, they're saying it out loud to a partner, right? They might even say it out loud to their whole group and maybe out loud to the whole class, right? So depending on their comfort level, they're speaking, they'll definitely speak with one person, which is pretty low pressure, but they have the opportunity to say it in front of the whole class too. What else? Kevin?
It allows them to practice pronunciations that are English specific, like the PH in photography, or Massachusetts, which is a
That's a hard one.
Yeah. Like I'm just thinking my mom still can't say Massachusetts after being here for 20 years.
Yeah, good.
Or like Lindsay.
And you could be very specific about the words you use to work on some skills that that person you know struggles with. Good. What else? Yeah.
Maybe you can help them feel more confident in using language in real life situations.
How so?
Because like on these textbooks for English learning, they're usually like really unrelated to the student, but these are all related to you, or maybe because the student is related to the student.
Yeah. Good. So it makes it more real life and more personal. Yeah. Man?
It helps them get introduced to you as the instructor.
Yeah. Good. Anything else? One thing that I try to do with English language learners is always give them that processing time on their own before they have to produce, right? So my starting by giving you a minute to write down some of those questions gives you time to process at your own speed. If we just opened up to the whole class at first and said, come up with questions that have these answers, and everyone was just sharing, that would only allow some people to participate who are really fast at that, right? But writing allows everybody to participate at their own speed and be comfortable before the sharing aspect. All right, I want to try one more. All right, so this is going to be a different lesson. Does anybody here speak Polish? Excellent. All right, so it's going to be brand new for all of you. So I'm going to teach you how to say hello, how are you in Polish. All right, it is dzień dobry, jak się masz? Okay, I'll do it one more time. Dzień dobry, jak się masz? Can you all say it? You all get it? Why not? All right. Why was that not effective? What do you need to learn that better? Why? Like I said it twice. I had you say it. Come on. What do you need to learn it better? Katie, what would you say?
Have it spelled out so I can try to like see how to spell it and see. I don't know. I feel like I could comprehended it and pronounced it a little bit better.
You'd like to see it?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, here it is. Dzień dobry, jak się masz? All right. So there, we've seen it. Anything else that would help you? Nana?
Like a phonetic spelling?
Phonetic spelling. Oh, if only I was in the future and had a phonetic spelling right underneath. Okay, so this is my phonetic spelling of it. Dzień dobry, jak się masz? So, a few things about this. One, if I was doing this with another person, I would have them do the phonetic spelling for themselves in a way that makes sense for them, right? I'm just doing it in a way that I can remember it, right? I learned this years ago. My brother lives in Poland, and when I was visiting, I wrote down a lot of things phonetically, and I actually learned much later that they were spelled totally different than I knew them, right? But for me, the phonetic spelling was what really helped me learn them. So for your learner, you would want them to write it phonetically so that it makes sense to them. Another thing here is that not all of these sounds quite exist in English, right? We don't really have this right here, and I'm not sure I'm actually even saying it perfectly. So I do my best, like ZHI is my zh, which isn't really an English sound. Doing those translations between sounds in languages can be really difficult, right? Because they don't always match up. How would you go about teaching somebody a sound in English that they don't have in their own language? What would you do, Kevin?
Emphasizing like mouth shape, like the actual like process your mouth goes through to make that sound.
Okay, good. So thinking about like the shape of your mouth. Good. What else would you have to pay attention to? Or what else would help somebody learn a sound they're not familiar with? Yeah.
Maybe getting if you know their native language, finding a closer equivalent.
Sure.
To how the sound is written.
Yeah. Yeah. So and that that can be super helpful to know their language. But sometimes you might, and sometimes you might not. Yeah. Katie?
Finding multiple words with that sound in it. So
Yeah.
you can hear it like saying a couple different ways.
Yeah, great. In different contexts. Different context always helps learn things, right? So if you're teaching a vocabulary word, don't just use that word in one sentence, but multiple ones. If you're learning a sound, do it in multiple words. Hearing it a lot of times will help, right? In terms of teaching like the mouth shape, like Kevin was saying, think about a bunch of things. Think about what your lips do when you say that word, what your teeth are doing, what your tongue is doing. All of those parts are what we, all those like parts of our mouth are what we use to make a sound. So I want you to actually practice that. What we're going to do is you're going to partner up, and we're going to work on two sounds that are difficult for a lot of people who are learning English, which is TH and R. Okay, we'll think of R like at the beginning of a word, like red or Robert, because it's different at the end of a word. So one partner is going to teach the other partner how to make a TH sound, and the other person is going to teach the person how to make an R sound. All right? So think, as you say it, what exactly is going on with your mouth, your teeth, your lips, tongue when you're making that sound, all right? So partner up. One person is going to teach the other how to say a TH, and the other one's going to teach the person how to say an R. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so you're like, well, first off, your lips are going. Yeah, you can vibrates.
And then you could use that little noise
So you bring your like pop it and it's going to feel like pop it.
For R, your tongue will stay inside your mouth.
I changed my R's.
Like gums right in the top. So, and then
We have R's.
it's kind of like a humming sound.
It feels uncomfortable, you're doing
It's hard to not. And you kind of vibrate there. So it'll be.
That's why so many.
Oh yeah, you roll.
No, not this
So your mouth is
one.
I never thought about it that way. Because you have it's like to go into a different mouth and like shoot.
So like,
Well, she said with this.
Oh, yeah.
It's really
Okay, did everybody have a chance to try? Can someone volunteer for the class, teach us how to say R at the beginning of a word, like Robert or Red? Someone try? How would you teach that one? How would you know how to say R? Come on. Yes, Mignon,
Actually,
thank
I'm
you.
not sure, but maybe when you're pronouncing raw, you're kind of putting air into your mouth, and your tongue's like, I don't know, raw. It's like raw.
Like this. Okay. So your tongue moves in that direction?
Yeah.
Good. The hand gesture could be really helpful if that's what's happening, right? It's because then it'll give that person a memory technique, right? And like rah, rah, right? And it does kind of like your tongue moves a little bit like that. And you and Dana, I heard, also came up with describing what the air in your mouth is doing, which we hadn't talked about, which is a good thing to point out too. How would TH? Can someone teach us how to make TH? It's a little bit easier. Yeah, okay.
So this was my partner's idea. It was really good. So you basically put your tongue against your teeth, and then you just let out some air through your teeth and tongue. It's like it's as if like you're going to talk, but like you just hold your tongue.
Good, good. And you can always see the tongue on a TH too. If you're making a TH sound and I can't see your tongue, then you're not making the correct sound. Good. You'll see it's really hard though, right? Like the more natural it is to you, the harder it is to teach it. And that goes with teaching English or teaching a computer skill, right? Like I saw somebody once teaching their learning partner how to use the mouse, and like we don't even think about that, right? It's so second nature. So like how do you teach someone who's never used a mouse before how to use one? It's like actually harder than you think. One more tip for the sounds is you might give that person a mirror because they can see your mouth doing it, but then they can watch their own mouth, right? They can look at you and look down and see their own mouth to see if they're making that sound in the same way too. Okay. I want to quickly go through, there's a great article called Barriers to Meaningful Instruction for English Learners, and it's on Blackboard under the extra reading section, so if you want to read the whole article, it's there, and I recommend it if you're teaching English language learners. But I'm going to just give you a very, very quick overview with the 4 barriers that this researcher identified, which can be helpful to think about. Her name is Lois Meyer, and she works at the University of New Mexico, and she came up with these 4 things: the cognitive load, the culture load, the language load, and the learning load. And if any of these are really high, then that can stop a person from being able to learn a language effectively. So we'll start with the first one, the cognitive load. The cognitive load is the number of new concepts embedded in the lesson or text, the background knowledge or experience needed for participation. So let's say your learner came in, right, and let's say they were from India, and you're like, we're going to do a lesson on baseball. And your learner might know cricket, but knows nothing about baseball, right? There's suddenly all this new stuff that they're trying to figure out. They're like, whoa, like, wait, someone's throwing the ball to somebody else, but someone's trying to hit it. Like, there's so much going on that they have to figure out in terms of background knowledge that they won't be able to focus on the vocabulary and the pronunciation and all those things, right? So think about what activity you're doing and what the cognitive load is, and whether you're overwhelming them with just like background knowledge. The second one is culture load. So the culture load is the amount of cultural knowledge needed to comprehend or participate, the cultural connotations that come with language. So some people say that there are no direct translations between languages, right? They're like, a word in Mandarin just does not have a direct translation to a word in English. That's like have too many connotations and cultural associations with them. And so the idea is, if you have a lot of cultural load, like if you're trying to teach some words that have a lot of cultural meanings to them in English, that you have to get into those, right? And if you don't get into those, that person's never going to really learn the language. So an example might even be between different countries that speak English, right? Like if an American is speaking with someone from Australia, and they're both talking about similar words that have different meanings, there might be misunderstandings because the cultural connotations of the word in English might be different from those in Australia. The third one's the language load. That's the amount of unfamiliar language encountered in a given situation. So think of this as like the difficulty, like if you're reading a text, the difficulty of that text. If you give someone like a first grade level text and a couple of those words are new, then they'll probably be able to learn a couple of words. But if you give them a high school level text and they're unfamiliar with 50% of the words, good luck with that, right? Like they're never going to be able to learn all those words, and so they won't understand that whole text because there's going to be so much they're overwhelmed with in terms of new vocabulary. And then the last one is the learning load, and that's think about the demands of a particular task or lesson, what the students are doing in a given activity. My example for that one is a brainstorm, right? So if as a class right now I said, all right, let's brainstorm some ways to teach English language learners, you could probably all do that without too much trouble. But if you were doing it in a different language, a brainstorm is actually pretty difficult because one, it's an unstructured conversation and there are no visual cues, right? You're not like looking at something, it's just like people talking. It's not necessarily flowing from one thing to another, right? Like Katie might say one thing and Brian says something totally different and Yihao says something totally different, right? And so it's hard to follow that conversation. And third is asking people to speak in front of the whole class, which is a difficult thing in a new language too, right? So there's a lot going on in terms of like the load of that lesson, which might stop people from actually participating and being able to participate and to like learn the language. Again, this whole article is on the website, on Blackboard if you're interested in seeing more. I want to get into a couple of things that might be useful to you, like practically when you're teaching English. So dialogues can be really useful, all right? You might find a dialogue online and you might talk through it with your learning partner or with a class. You might have people practice in pairs. Or you might write one with that person. If their English is pretty good, you might sit down with them and write this dialogue, right, together. Then what you can do with a dialogue is you can turn it into something called a close. And a close means that you just take out certain words and you have them fill in those words. And you can make that of varying levels of difficulty, right? So I made this a pretty easy one, right? We've got like the word dinner and lunch and love, words that like a relatively beginner learner would be able to know, but you can make it more difficult. Well, let's say you had a whole class of learners and they're at different levels. I make 3 different closes, an easy, a medium, and a challenge one. Put them all up at the front of the room and say, like, come get the one that you want. The easy one, the intermediate, or the challenge one. And then people can choose where they're at and take that level one. All right, a few tips for teaching English that you can think about. So we went over some of them as a class, like from your experience before, which were really helpful. I'm going to add a few to that. One of them is task repetition. We talked about patience, but also along with patience comes like doing it over and over and over again, right? Because if I teach you how to say, hello, how are you, one time, and then we don't ever come back to it, like how many people here remember how to say, hello, how are you in Polish? Right? Because we didn't do it very much, right? So you have to do it over and over again. And then the next week you have to reintroduce it, and the next week do it again. That actually goes with anything you're learning, right? Like repetition really is the key. Pay attention to the tense demands. We haven't talked much about this yet, but tenses come really naturally to us in our native language. But remember, when you've learned another language, one of the things you spend most time on is like present tense, future tense, past tense, and then you have like present imperfect and like present indicative and all these complicated tenses, right? And they come naturally to us, but pay attention to what you're asking your learner to do. So maybe you could focus in on just past tense and say, tell me what you did this weekend, tell me what you did yesterday. But if you mix that in with, what are you doing tomorrow, that's adding another layer of complication, right? So think about what you're asking them to do in terms of tense. You can have an explicit conversation with your learner or your group of learners about what the goal is, whether they want to be able to speak perfect English or whether they want to be understood. And maybe that's going to change as a goal over time. So maybe you start out with, okay, let's make our goal for you to be understood by your coworkers so you can tell them what you want, right? Once you can do that, then we'll work on like how perfect your English is and we'll make it grammatically correct. But you might not want to go in if their English is really low and be correcting them on every single little thing, even if they're understandable, right? Because that's not the goal at first. Don't be afraid to correct mistakes, but don't overcorrect so the learner becomes afraid to take risks. We talked about that a little bit before, right? You don't want to like shut them down, but also don't never correct them because the point is you're teaching them. And if they're making mistakes and you don't correct them in some way, they're not going to learn from those. And on a sheet that I have a handout, I'll show you, there's I think 5 different ways of correcting a learner that you can think about of like how you correct the mistake to make it useful to them. And try to make your decisions, your corrections thematic. So maybe focus on just verb tense at one time, or focus just on plurals, or focus just on subject-verb agreement, right? Depending on what you notice the needs of your learner are, if you are giving them advice on one thing over here and then another thing that's totally different, that's going to be confusing to them. But if you can focus in on like a certain thematic element of English, then they'll see consistency and they'll be able to focus on that at one time. So there's a few tips to go with. One more. That's teach colloquial English for conversation. So you might find that your learner learns English in school and they learn like a very formal English that we don't necessarily use. And so you can talk to them like, what would you say if you're talking to your supervisor? What would you say if you're talking to your friend, right? And those might sound very different. You don't want people who are going around saying, hello, how are you? I am good. I am good, thank you, because nobody talks like that, right? So teach them the way that people talk so they're not just English language robots, but they actually like can communicate in ways that are useful. I want to give you a handout that has a few activities on it, as well as that methods of correcting people in their speech. You're welcome. Good. 15 minutes, okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, everybody get a copy? All right, so I want to go through the activities first. Let's just go around the room, read one bullet point and then any sub-bullet points associated with it for the class. Matt, you want to start for us?
Yeah. Mapping words on pictures.
Thank you. So that would be like you put a picture on the board, and it's a picture of a playground. Or sorry, if you're going to write on, you might want to give them the picture, like print it out, and have them write down all the things they can identify in that picture. That's like a vocabulary building exercise, right?
So closes. So like introduce the text or dialogue, practice it, and give a version of blanks. To differentiate with a class, give different versions with different difficulties of words missing.
Good, yep. And differentiate, if you haven't encountered that word, differentiate means like you're doing different things for different levels of learners within a class, like a whole group. If you're working one-on-one with somebody, then you're not differentiating. Yeah.
Write or tell a story around a set of pictures. Easy pictures that clearly relate, harder pictures that seem unconnected. Tell the story to a partner order the pictures. Give wordless cartoons that lead through a situation, like getting injured and calling the doctor, and then talk through or scripted talks.
Good, so this is like a little bit more advanced than just like giving the picture and mapping words onto it. This is like, all right, I give 5 pictures, and that person uses those pictures to create a story or something a little more complicated. Sarah?
Language apps. Duolingo, BBC Learning English, which has lessons around current events, and Fluent U.
And this is just scratching the surface. There are lots of language apps out there, and I don't know most of them, but you can do some exploring. Some of them are free, some of them you pay a subscription to. But if your learner wants something to practice during the week, when you're not seeing them, you might recommend that they put something on their smartphone to practice. Kevin?
Written conversations or text conversations.
Yep. So rather, like, speaking is a different skill than writing, right? So maybe you have a piece of paper and I write, "Hi Kevin, how are you?" And then I give Kevin the paper and he writes his response. Or we could sit next to each other with our phones and we could have a text conversation, right? Which is a different skill than talking. Morgan?
20 questions, more advanced cultural knowledge needed.
Good. Have you all played 20 questions before? Like one person asks the other yes or no questions to try to figure out what the answer is. It requires a lot of cultural knowledge, right? So if like I'm thinking of Beyonce, then I need to make sure that you know Beyonce, right? Or it might not work. Chung?
Tongue twisters for pronunciation.
Good. So tongue twisters, as long as they're at the level of your learner, can be good. Stephanie?
Songs like pop, not kid songs, print the lyrics and try to sing along.
Good. And somebody mentioned that already, but like that's a good way to work on pronunciation and cadence. Right? Great.
Speech imitation. Watch a speech, try to learn it and mimic it. Subtitles can help. Be mindful of cultural sensitivities with imitation. Eventually mute with just subtitles and dub it.
Good. Thank you, Emma.
Role play work situation. So asking for time off, explaining why you're late, teaching a new coworker how to do something on the job, etc.
Good. And this is getting into like really relevant real world things, right? You don't want to keep it like in the theoretical, but do things that'll help them in their everyday lives. Right? Yeah. The training manual?
Yeah.
Third bottom.
Oh, sorry. Writing a training manual for new employers. Present to employee training.
Good. Thank you. Nina? Charades. So you like you're acting things out and getting them to guess. And Young, last one?
Mock interview, playing real jobs that you might want in the
Good, thank you. And then the bottom part there, those are the methods of correction that you might think about. So there are different ways, like let's say your learner makes a mistake. Do you ask them to try it again? Do you tell them exactly what happened wrong? Do you rephrase it for them so they can hear it the correct way? There's a lot of different things that are useful in different ways, so you can keep those in mind. I'll let you read those on your own, because I want to do one quick wrap-up activity, which is to put all this to use. Think about what you've learned today. So the last thing to practice, here's the situation. Your learning partner has fairly limited English, and they want to ask for time off, or she wants to ask for time off to attend her daughter's wedding in Kansas. So I want you to brainstorm with a partner. What are some things you might do to help her prepare to talk to her supervisor? And what will you be keeping in mind about teaching an English language learner as you're creating this? All right. So let's take 5 minutes and then we'll share a couple of ideas at the end. So turn to a partner and plan out what might you do to help your learning partner prepare for that situation. What will you be thinking about English language learning as you do so? Go ahead.
Feeling nervous about talking to their supervisor, like that. I don't know if it's a practice or you're talking about it. And that really document it, and then just like